Over the last few months, Kedlin began to suspect that her husband was spending too much time online, especially during the night. At first, her thoughts leaned towards the possibility of infidelity on Gilberto's part, but over time, this notion seemed less and less likely to her. One day, it so happened that the young man's computer broke down, and he turned to his wife, asking to borrow her laptop. Kedlin decided to take advantage of the opportunity and check her suspicions. She could no longer contain her emotions and wanted to find out as soon as possible what exactly Gilberto was up to. Before handing over her laptop to her husband, she installed a tracking program on it. However, Kedlin could not even imagine what she would discover. Gilberto's web search history shocked her. It turned out that the man was interested in things like cooking dishes from human flesh, human trafficking, and illegal imprisonment. In addition, Kedlin found hundreds of images depicting torture against women. But that wasn't all. She also learned that Gilberto was a member of an extremely controversial internet forum dedicated to a specific form, as well as discussions of attacks on women and. On this forum, Kedlin's husband was known under a pseudonym that could be translated as Hunter of Female Flesh. While spending time there, Gilberto regularly communicated with other men who shared his interests. For the most part, their conversations revolved around a single topic: the abduction and murder of women with the subsequent consumption of their remains. In one of the recent discussions, the men fantasized about simultaneously torturing 3 different women. They believed that this would intensify their fear. One of the victims was planned to be burned alive, while the other 2 were to be impaled on a spit and roasted over an open fire, taking short breaks to prolong their agony. But perhaps the most horrific desire or fantasy of these men was the actual eating of women. They could spend hours sharing their gruesome fascinations with each other and discussing how to bring them to life. It is noteworthy that many of the women on the list of potential victims were acquainted with Gilberto. He had even visited one of them just a few days before his wife discovered these messages. He and his friends discussed how they would kidnap this woman, throw a party for themselves, and savor every piece of her body. It is important to note that, using his official position, the man gained access to the police database and thus learned all the necessary information about his potential victims. But perhaps what shocked Kedlin herself the most was that her husband discussed with other men what he would do to her. During this conversation, Gilberto said that he would first tie her legs to prevent escape. Then he would gag her mouth so that she could not call for help, and then he planned to slit her throat, relishing the sight of her blood slowly flowing out. In one of the messages, Gilberto also wrote that he likes to watch Kedlin while she sleeps, because she doesn't even suspect that her days are numbered. One of the participants in this discussion even asked the man if he was going to eat his wife afterwards, to which he replied that her flesh must be very tasty. After reading all these conversations, Kedlin took her daughter, fled the house, and hid at her parents' place. Having told them about what she had learned, they immediately contacted the FBI. Soon, a group of agents met with Kedlin, and she provided them with access to her laptop. As a result, the agents received confirmation that a group of men was planning to kill women and then consume their remains as food. Details emerged about exactly how these men were going to carry out the abductions and who was on the list of their potential victims. It also turned out that Gilberto already had the addresses and phone numbers of most of these women. In this regard, at the end of October 2012, after all the necessary information was gathered, 28-year-old Gilberto Valle was arrested. According to the data presented in the official indictment, the young man's computer contained a dossier on more than 100 women. In fact, it contained not only their names and addresses but also some other personal information. Shortly after the start of a large-scale investigation, at least 10 women from the list were interviewed by the investigators, and all of them confirmed that they personally knew Gilberto. And although it all began with his morbid fantasies, in reality, the young man took several quite real steps to bring them to life. For example, he had been watching potential victims for a long time to hone his plan to perfection. In one of the numerous messages intercepted by FBI agents, Gilberto was communicating with his alleged accomplice. The latter inquired about how his lunch had gone, and the young man replied that everything had been successful. It was assumed that this referred to a possible meeting between Gilberto and his longtime acquaintance, whom he had known for 4 years. According to his own words, he had fantasized about eating her from the very moment of their acquaintance. It later became known that this meeting had indeed taken place. Moreover, the young man had gone to it together with his wife Ketlin, because after a long break in communication, this girl could not even imagine that Gilberto did not actually have warm feelings for her, but only wanted to take her life and feast on her flesh. In any case, immediately after this meeting, the young man and his wife headed home, and he, without wasting time, sat down at the computer to write to his accomplice. Gilberto admitted that he had barely restrained himself during the meeting, constantly thinking about how to kidnap the woman. His interlocutor, developing this topic, inquired about the size of Gilberto's oven, to which he replied that it was spacious enough to fit one of the potential victims. It seems that such conversations were to Gilberto's liking, and he continued to fantasize about how he would turn on the oven and fry one of his victims over a slow fire, savoring every moment. Undoubtedly, the FBI agents were shocked by these conversations, and they did not perceive them as any kind of game at all, since Gilberto had actually met with his possible victim. Moreover, he claimed that he was closer than ever to taking the next step. In addition, he was thoroughly preparing for the abduction, studying various methods of poisoning and immobilizing victims. He even had acquaintances who were ready to carry out the kidnapping for a reward. In particular, one of them agreed to kidnap any girl from Gilberto's list for only $5,000. In other words, as the investigation progressed, the investigators got the impression that Gilberto was striving to become a kind of expert in this field. At least his approach to selecting victims was already quite professional, as evidenced by his dossier, which contained information about potential victims, as well as objects and substances that could be needed during the abduction. Considering all this, Gilberto was not only kept in custody but also transferred to a solitary confinement cell. According to some reports, he was already facing life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. And this is not surprising because he was accused of conspiracy to kidnap people, as well as illegal access to confidential information. The prosecutor in this case emphasized that it was even more concerning because at the time of his detention, Gilberto Valle was an active police officer in New York and had sworn to serve society. However, shortly after his arrest, he was dismissed from the service, and his wife, along with their daughter, moved to Nevada. Meanwhile, the media discussed the fact that Gilberto Valle was not only a police officer but also a certified psychologist. As it became known, for a long time the young man had worked at a police station in Harlem. At the same time, Gilberto's colleagues and friends always considered him a decent guy. However, as we already know, at the beginning of June 2012, his wife Ketlin began to notice that after returning from work, instead of going to bed, he would spend hours sitting at the computer. According to the girl, there were nights when Gilberto did not go to bed at all, explaining it by insomnia. It was also known that on the aforementioned internet forum, the young man communicated with 24 men who had the same perverted fantasies as he did. However, most often he corresponded with several people, one of whom was a 23-year-old mechanic named Michael Van Hees. He was arrested a few days after Gilberto's arrest. It was believed that he could be an accomplice in a potential crime and even planned to kidnap his own sister. Michael's arrest, in turn, led to the detention of another person named Robert Christopher Ashe. He was 61 years old and had previously worked as a librarian at one of New York's schools. According to Michael, he and Robert had once met in person to discuss a possible abduction. Obviously, Robert shared the desires of Gilberto and Michael, but he was interested not only in women but also in children. Therefore, the authorities began a more thorough investigation of Robert. The FBI even sent 2 undercover agents to gain the man's trust. And during searches of his home, numerous torture devices were found, including whips, a stun gun, handcuffs, nails, gloves, and many other items that he was going to use for his purposes. The general nature of this case implied life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for all detainees. However, shortly before the start of the trial, a serious problem arose related to the fundamental principles of freedom of thought and speech. In other words, the essence of the problem was that, despite numerous conclusions, the authorities were unable to find convincing evidence that even one of the listed women had been attacked by the arrested men. Thus, all this could be attributed to their morbid fantasies. Gilberto's lawyers also adhered to this version. However, the prosecution had a different opinion, and although there were indeed no real victims, it was quite likely that all these ideas could eventually materialize. Be that as it may, this case sparked heated discussions and became the subject of numerous speculations in various social circles. Law schools at various universities also took an interest in this unusual case, as it raised many important issues of both a legal and psychological nature. However, perhaps the most important question was whether fantasy alone could provoke a crime and how, in such a case, to judge the alleged criminals in the absence of real victims. As a result, serious disagreements arose among the jurors, since all the detainees were only potential criminals who should have been put behind bars even before they committed their crime. In the United States, such types of crimes are commonly referred to as thought crimes. Usually, they are characterized by preliminary preparation for the crime and the very intention to commit it. And given the fact that the truly perverted and hate-filled fantasies of the detainees undoubtedly reflected their sick imagination, they simply had to be sent to prison. However, according to their lawyers, the authorities did not have sufficient grounds for a guilty verdict. Be that as it may, after a few months, the judge announced the final verdict. To everyone's surprise, all charges against Gilberto Valle were dropped, as it was confirmed that his conversations were more related to fantasies than to reality. For his part, Michael Van Hees was sentenced to 7 years in prison, since in his case, he and one of his accomplices had come close to committing a crime. As for Robert Christopher Ashe, he received 15 years behind bars for his attempt to kill FBI agents who were working undercover. Undoubtedly, the final verdict left some room for reflection and discussion. Usually, in court, we are judged by our actions, not by our thoughts. But what should be done in cases where these thoughts take over the mind? So at what point are our thoughts considered normal, or can we still fantasize about various topics as long as it does not harm others? Thank you for watching this story. Write your thoughts about it in the comments. Don't miss the future videos, subscribe and like the channel. Take care of yourself and people you love.